In the early decades of the 13th century, the vast plains stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia had begun to experience a new and deeply unsettling phenomenon. Entire kingdoms were collapsing. Armies that had once been considered invincible were vanishing in a matter of weeks. Cities that had stood for centuries were burning in days. Refugees streamed westward with stories that seemed almost impossible to believe. They spoke of riders who moved like shadows across the steppe. Armies that never seemed to tire. Commanders who rarely appeared in battle until the exact moment when their enemy had already made a fatal mistake. To many rulers in Eastern Europe, these accounts sounded exaggerated. The steppe had always produced raiders and nomadic confederations. Scythians, Huns, Pecheneg, Cumans. Waves of mounted warriors had emerged from the grasslands before. But this was something different. By the year 1223, the name of the force responsible was still unfamiliar in the courts of the Rus princes. The Mongols. Their rise had begun thousands of kilometers away in the harsh landscapes of Mongolia, where scattered nomadic tribes had spent generations fighting one another for survival. In that unforgiving environment, military organization was not merely an advantage, it was a necessity. Under the leadership of a man who would later be known to history as Genghis Khan, those tribes had been forged into something far more dangerous than a typical steppe alliance. They became a machine. Discipline was absolute. Mobility was unmatched. Intelligence gathering became a systematic art. Every campaign was studied, every failure analyzed, every victory refined into doctrine. Within 2 decades, the Mongol armies had swept across northern China, Central Asia, and Persia with terrifying speed. Entire empires had disintegrated under their pressure. But the events that would eventually lead to the Battle of the Kalka River were not originally intended to open a new front in Eastern Europe. They began as something far smaller, a reconnaissance mission. Around 1220, 2 of Genghis Khan's most capable generals, Subutai and Jebe, were dispatched westward following the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. Their task was not conquest. It was exploration. They were to push deep into unknown territories, map the political landscape, test the strength of potential enemies, and return with intelligence that could guide future campaigns. For 2 veteran commanders who had spent decades fighting across Asia, the assignment demanded a unique balance of aggression and restraint. They would advance far beyond the safe lines of the Mongol heartland, with only a relatively small force, perhaps 20,000 cavalry. If they miscalculated, there would be no immediate reinforcement. But if they succeeded, they would uncover the vulnerabilities of entire civilizations. And so they rode west, across the Caucasus Mountains, through territories controlled by the Alans and the Cumans, nomadic tribes who themselves had long dominated the steppe north of the Black Sea. At first, these groups attempted resistance. The Alans and Cumans formed an alliance and confronted the Mongol advance together. But the Mongol commanders were not interested in fighting a united enemy. Instead, they applied a tactic that had already become a recurring feature of Mongol strategy: division. Through negotiation and manipulation, the Mongols convinced the Cumans to abandon their Alan allies, promising peace in exchange for neutrality. Once the alliance fractured, the Mongol cavalry turned on the Alans and destroyed them. Then, as the Cumans began to realize the deception too late, the Mongols pursued them as well. What followed was a relentless campaign of pursuit across the steppe. The Cuman tribes scattered westward, their camps dismantled in haste as Mongol horsemen pressed behind them with alarming speed. For the Cumans, there was only one direction left to run: toward the lands of the Rus. The Rus principalities were not a unified kingdom but a loose collection of rival states: Kiev, Galicia, Chernihiv, Smolensk, and others, each ruled by its own prince, each often competing with the others for influence and territory. Political cooperation among them was rare. But the sudden arrival of desperate Cuman refugees began to change the situation. The Cuman leader, Khan Koshin, approached the Rus princes with a warning that could not easily be ignored. The same army that had shattered the Alans and driven the Cumans from the steppe was now approaching the borders of their world. If the Rus allowed the Mongols to destroy the Cumans first, Koshin argued, nothing would stand between the Mongols and the Rus lands themselves. It was not a simple appeal for help. It was a warning of what might come next. The Rus princes faced a difficult calculation. Many of them distrusted the Cumans deeply. For generations, Cuman raids had plagued the frontier territories of the Rus states. But now the political reality had shifted. The Mongols were unknown. Their methods, their intentions, their strength. None of it was clearly understood. And yet the pattern emerging from distant reports was unmistakable. Where Mongol armies appeared, established powers collapsed. Gradually, the Rus princes began to assemble a coalition. It was an uneasy alliance, bound more by fear of the unknown than by genuine unity. Princes from Kiev, Galicia, Volhynia, and other principalities gathered their forces. The Cumans joined them as well, bringing their own cavalry warriors to the coalition army. Together, they planned to march eastward onto the open steppe and confront the invaders before the Mongols could approach the settled lands of the Rus. From the perspective of the Rus commanders, the logic seemed straightforward. Their combined force was enormous by regional standards, perhaps 80,000 men or more when including the Cuman cavalry.
Infantry from the Rus cities, armored noble retinues, mounted warriors, and steppe riders now formed a massive coalition army. Against them, the Mongol force appeared comparatively small, and more importantly, it was far from home. The Mongols had traveled thousands of kilometers from their base of operations. Surely their supply lines were stretched. Surely their numbers could not match the combined armies now assembling against them. But the Mongol generals observing these developments were not alarmed. Subutai and Jebe had anticipated exactly this reaction. Their mission had never been to conquer the Rus territories in 1223. It was to study them, to provoke them, to see how their armies moved, how their commanders made decisions, how quickly they coordinated, and how easily they could be manipulated. In this sense, the approaching battle was not merely a confrontation between two armies. It was an experiment. As the Rus coalition began its advance eastward across the vast open steppe, the Mongols began to withdraw, at first slowly, then more rapidly. Small Mongol detachments appeared briefly on the horizon before disappearing again. Scouts reported sightings of retreating horsemen. Dust clouds suggested an army pulling back under pressure. To the Rus commanders, this seemed like confirmation of what they already believed. The Mongols were afraid. The coalition army pushed forward with increasing confidence, driving deeper into unfamiliar territory in pursuit of what they assumed was a retreating enemy. But the Mongol withdrawal was not disorder. It was deliberate. Day after day, the Rus forces advanced across the endless grasslands, chasing an enemy that never fully committed to battle. Weeks passed. Supply lines stretched longer. Coordination between the different Rus princes began to weaken as their armies spread out across the open terrain. And somewhere ahead, beyond the distant horizon, Subutai and Jebe were carefully selecting the ground where the next phase of their plan would unfold. The place where pursuit would become entrapment. The place where the coalition army, large, confident, and increasingly disorganized, would finally collide with battlefield the Mongols had already prepared. Near a quiet tributary known as the Kalka River, the Rus army believed they were chasing a fleeing enemy. In reality, they were riding directly into a trap that had been unfolding for nearly 1,000 kilometers. And by the time they realized it, turning back would no longer be possible. For nearly 9 days, the coalition army of the Rus princes and their Cuman allies continued to move eastward across the steppe. At first, the pursuit had carried the energy of confidence. Scouts reported Mongol detachments repeatedly appearing ahead, only to vanish again before the coalition army could bring them to battle. Each sighting reinforced the belief that the Mongols were retreating under pressure. But the scale of the steppe had begun to change the nature of the campaign. The open grassland stretching toward the east offered almost no natural landmarks. The horizon rolled endlessly in every direction, broken only by shallow river valleys and distant ridgelines. Armies moving through this landscape could easily lose cohesion. Dust clouds, scattered reconnaissance parties, and long marching columns created confusion about where different contingents actually were. The Rus coalition had been formed quickly, and its command structure reflected the political realities of the principalities. There was no single unified commander. Instead, Several princes led their own retinues and contingents, each retaining authority over their own men. Among the most prominent were Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, Mstislav of Kiev, and other regional rulers who had brought their forces to campaign. In theory, they were allies. In practice, coordination depended on constant communication and mutual restraint. Two things that became increasingly difficult during prolonged pursuit across the steppe. Meanwhile, the Cumans move ahead as the vanguard. Their horsemen were experienced steppe riders, accustomed to the terrain and to the style of warfare used by nomadic cavalry. They pressed forward aggressively, eager to reclaim honor after their earlier defeat at Mongol hands. But the Mongol commanders watching this advance understood something that the coalition leaders did not yet fully appreciate. The longer the pursuit continued, the more the coalition army would begin to fragment. Columns stretched out over great distances. Units marching at different speeds began to separate from one another. Some princes pushed forward aggressively, while others advanced more cautiously. Each decision widened the gaps between them. Subutai and Geb were not simply retreating. They were shaping the battlefield. Their army, composed almost entirely of highly mobile cavalry, could move faster, communicate more effectively, and concentrate force with far greater precision than the coalition army chasing them. The Mongol soldiers themselves were hardened veterans of dozens of campaigns. Each warrior typically maintained several horses, allowing them to rotate mounts during long marches. Their equipment was designed for endurance and mobility. Composite bows capable of lethal accuracy at great distances, curved sabers for close combat, and armor that balanced protection with speed. But perhaps more important than their equipment was their discipline. Mongol units operated in tightly organized formations built around a decimal system. Groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Orders moved quickly through this structure, allowing commanders to maneuver large forces with remarkable flexibility. The Rus coalition army, by contrast, represented a mixture of military traditions. The Rus princes fielded heavily armed cavalry drawn from their noble retinues, warriors accustomed to close combat and decisive charges. Supporting them were infantry forces from various cities and territories, often equipped with spears, shields, and axes. Alongside them rode the Cumans, whose own cavalry tactics resembled steppe warfare, but lacked the rigid discipline of the Mongol system. In total, the coalition army was formidable in size, but it lacked a single strategic mind directing its movements. And as the pursuit continued, impatience began to grow. Some commanders believed the Mongols were simply delaying the inevitable. If they pressed forward harder, they reasoned, the enemy might finally be forced to stand and fight. One of the most aggressive voices urging continued pursuit was Mstislav the Bold. His forces began to push further ahead of the rest of the coalition, eager to catch the Mongols before they could escape deeper into the steppe. From the Mongol perspective, this was exactly the reaction they had hoped to provoke. The trap required time. It required distance. And most importantly, it required the coalition army to abandon its cohesion. Eventually, the moment came. Near the banks of the Kalka River, the Mongol commanders halted their withdrawal. The terrain here offered subtle but important advantages. Rolling hills and shallow valleys created natural concealment. Portions of the Mongol force could remain hidden behind ridgelines, while smaller detachments remained visible to approaching enemies. To a pursuing army, it would appear that the Mongols had finally stopped to make a desperate stand. But what the Rus scouts saw was only a fragment of the true battlefield. When the Cuman vanguard encountered the Mongol rear guard near the Kalka River, they reacted immediately. After days of pursuit, it seemed that the opportunity for battle had finally arrived. The Cumans charged. At first, the Mongol cavalry ahead of them appeared to retreat once again, drawing the Cuman riders forward across the open ground. But this time the movement was shorter, more controlled. Behind the ridges and low hills surrounding the valley, Mongol formations were already maneuvering into position. Subutai had carefully arranged his forces. One portion would absorb the initial contact. Another would circle outward along the flanks. A third would remain concealed until the moment when the enemy's advance had stretched too far to recover. As the Cuman cavalry pressed forward, they began to encounter increasingly organized resistance. Mongol horse archers turned in their saddles and unleashed volleys of arrows while riding at full speed. Composite bows sent arrows slicing across the battlefield with deadly force, striking horses and riders alike. The Cumans, accustomed to steppe combat, attempted to respond with their own archery, but the Mongol formations maintained disciplined spacing, continuously maneuvering while maintaining a steady rain of arrows. Soon the first signs of confusion began to spread among the coalition forces behind the vanguard. Dust clouds obscured visibility. Units arriving later struggled to understand what was happening ahead of them. Some Rus contingents rushed forward to support the Cumans, while others were still marching toward the battlefield from miles behind. The coalition army was entering the fight in fragments. Exactly as Subutai had intended, the Mongol cavalry suddenly shifted tactics. Instead of retreating, several formations wheeled around and began advancing toward the approaching Rus forces. Their movements were precise and coordinated, as if responding to signals that the coalition army could not yet see. At the same moment, Mongol units that had remained hidden behind nearby ridges began to emerge. From the flanks, from the rear, horsemen appeared where moments earlier there had seemed to be empty steppe. For the Rus commanders arriving on the battlefield, the situation was rapidly becoming unclear. What had begun as a pursuit now resembled something far more dangerous. Their army was no longer advancing as a single mass. Instead, isolated contingents were colliding with Mongol formations in different parts of the battlefield, unable to see the full shape of the enemy deployment. Communication between the princes became nearly impossible amid the dust, noise, and chaos of rapidly moving cavalry. Meanwhile, the Mongol archers continued their relentless assault. They targeted horses first whenever possible, knowing that dismounted knights would lose both mobility and tactical cohesion. Arrows struck shields, armor gaps, and exposed riders as Mongol units galloped past, loosing arrows in continuous motion. Each engagement was brief. Then the Mongols would withdraw slightly, drawing their pursuers further into the expanding battlefield. For the Rus soldiers on the ground, the enemy seemed to appear and vanish unpredictably. Moments of apparent success, when Mongol units seemed to retreat again, were followed by sudden attacks from unexpected directions. Gradually, the psychological pressure began to mount. The coalition army had entered the battle believing it was confronting a smaller force already weakened by weeks of retreat. But now the battlefield itself seemed to be shifting around them. More Mongol riders kept appearing. Their movements were coordinated. Their attacks came in waves, and the further the Rus and Cuman forces pushed forward, the more difficult it became to regroup with the rest of the coalition. Somewhere beyond the confusion, Subutai watched the unfolding engagement carefully. The trap was not yet fully closed, but the coalition army was already beginning to fragment. And once fragmentation turned into isolation, the next phase would begin. At the Kalka River, the battle had finally started. But the most decisive moment, the point where pursuit would transform into catastrophe, was still approaching. And when it arrived, the coalition army would discover that the enemy they believed they had been chasing had been controlling the battlefield all along. As the battle spread across the plains near the Kalka River, the coalition army was no longer acting as a unified force. Instead, it had become a series of disconnected engagements scattered across miles of open terrain. Some Rus contingents were still marching toward the battlefield, unaware that the fighting had already begun. Others had entered the engagement early, drawn forward by the Cuman vanguard's pursuit. Between them stretched wide gaps where no organized line existed. For the Mongol commanders, this fragmentation was a decisive condition they had been waiting for. Subutai understood that the strength of the Rus coalition lay in its size. If the entire army had arrived together, forming a solid mass of infantry supported by heavy cavalry, the battle might have taken on a far more dangerous character. But now that advantage was dissolving. The Mongol army could fight smaller portions of the coalition one at a time, and they moved quickly to exploit that opportunity. The first major collapse occurred among the Cuman cavalry at the front of the battlefield. For days they had ridden at the head of pursuit, pushing forward with the determination of warriors eager to avenge earlier defeats. But once the Mongol formations began closing in from multiple directions, the situation shifted rapidly. The Cumans were skilled riders, but they lacked the centralized discipline that defined Mongol command structures. As Mongol archers intensified their attacks, the Cuman lines began to lose cohesion. Arrows struck horses and riders in rapid succession. Mongol cavalry units rode past them in coordinated waves, releasing volleys while maintaining speed and spacing that made retaliation difficult. Then came the moment that shattered their formation. From behind a low ridge near the battlefield's flank, a large Mongol contingent suddenly appeared and charged directly into the exposed side of the Cuman forces. The attack was swift and overwhelming. With pressure mounting from several directions, the Cuman warriors began to break. At first, small groups attempted to withdraw to reorganize, but the open steppe offered little protection once cohesion was lost. Soon the withdrawal became a full retreat, and that retreat moved directly back through the advancing Rus formations. For the Rus soldiers who had been pushing forward behind the Cuman cavalry, the sudden sight of thousands of fleeing horsemen racing toward them created immediate confusion. Dust clouds surged across the battlefield. Riders shouted warnings that were difficult to understand amid the noise of combat. Some Rus units attempted to hold their ground, while others instinctively shifted aside to avoid being swept away by the retreating allies. In that moment of uncertainty, the Mongol cavalry struck again. Horse archers surged forward, targeting the disorganized clusters of Rus warriors now exposed without the protective screen of the Cuman vanguard. Arrows cut through the crowded formations. Horses collapsed beneath their riders. Noble retinues that had expected to fight in coordinated charges suddenly found themselves surrounded by rapidly maneuvering enemies. The coalition army had lost its forward shield, and now its center was vulnerable. Prince Mstislav the Bold attempted to rally his forces and push forward to the chaos, hoping to regain momentum by launching a decisive attack against the Mongol lines. But the battlefield he confronted was nothing like the one he had anticipated. Instead of a single enemy formation, Mongol cavalry units appeared in multiple directions, circling and firing from a distance before withdrawing again. Attempt to organize a heavy cavalry charge faltered as arrows struck horses and disrupted the formation before it could build momentum. Meanwhile, other Rus contingents arriving on the battlefield encountered an even more confusing situation. They saw retreating allies, scattered fighting, and Mongol riders moving rapidly across the terrain. Without clear signals from the other princes, many units entered the battle independently, unaware of how severely the coalition had already been weakened. Subutized forces continued to apply pressure with relentless precision. They avoided prolonged close combat whenever possible, instead relying on mobility and missile fire to break the enemy's cohesion further. When isolated groups of Rus soldiers attempted to stand their ground, Mongol cavalry would circle them, tightening the ring of arrows until resistance weakened. Then, and only then, would they close in for direct combat. Gradually, what had begun as a complex battlefield engagement turned into a series of localized massacres. One Rus contingent after another was cut off from arrest. The battlefield stretched wider as fleeing units attempted to escape the encirclement. Some attempted to regroup along the banks of the Kalka River, hoping that the natural barrier might offer protection. But the Mongols pressed them relentlessly. Pursuit was one of the defining elements of Mongol warfare. Once an enemy army began to collapse, the Mongol cavalry shifted from controlled engagement to relentless chase. Riders pursued fleeing soldiers across the steppe, cutting down those who could not maintain speed. The battle turned into a running disaster. Among the coalition leaders, the situation became increasingly desperate. Prince Mstislav of Kiev eventually withdrew with a portion of his forces to a nearby hill, where they constructed a defensive camp using wagons and shields. From this improvised fortification, they attempted to hold out against the Mongol advance. For 3 days, the defenders resisted. Mongol forces surrounded the position but initially avoided direct assault, continuing instead to apply pressure through archery and psychological intimidation. Finally, the Mongols offered terms. If the Rus defenders surrendered, their lives would be spared. Exhausted and isolated, the defenders accepted the promise. But the Mongol interpretation of surrender was shaped by their own traditions of warfare. According to several historical accounts, the captured Rus princes were executed in a manner intended both as punishment and as symbolic demonstration of Mongol dominance. They were placed beneath large wooden boards. Then Mongol commanders and soldiers sat atop the structure, holding a feast while the weight slowly crushed the prisoners beneath them. It was a brutal end that reflected the harsh realities of steppe warfare. Across the battlefield and surrounding steppe, the destruction of the coalition army was nearly complete.